So, hi, and welcome to the first non-Movember episode of I Mustache You Something. A lot of people said, hey, we don't want to wait till next November for more of these conversations. And I said, well, I don't know if I know more than 30 people, but I was lucky that Lydia Khalil, actually, did you change is that your maiden name or is that your new name?
Both. So people who know Peter and I know that we both have the same last name.
Wow. I was like,
Yes.
oh wait, I don't want to step on any toes here because I know you as Lydia Khalil.
Right.
Um, but
So
we,
Peter is also Peter Khalil. And so I said yes, mostly out of the convenience factor.
oh yeah, I mean, I think Mary has similar sort of like, yeah, it was just easier to say okay. Um, so Lydia and so Mary, my wife, grew up with Lydia, and we met in adulthood. So we didn't grow up together, but we have like that sort of like marriage connection growing up. But I was so excited when, at the end of the month, she was like, hey, I don't know if you're still doing this, and I said, yeah, perfect. We're actually going to continue afterwards. So I was excited for such a strong person that I really wanted to stash something to connect at the end of the month so we can continue this. So, Lydia, tell us. So, I know when you were here, you worked for the Boston Police Department, right? You worked for their communications department? Or
No, I actually worked mostly in their intelligence and counterterrorism divisions.
okay.
Yeah. So it did involve kind of a lot of community policing and broader policy efforts and stuff like that. But it was mostly on counterterrorism and intelligence because that's kind of my professional background. It's in national security. So I came to Boston Police actually because I was looking to move back home to Boston, and I'd spent most of my career working in New York and Washington, D.C. in foreign policy and national security circles. And so I thought, well, how can I continue doing that stuff while also being local for a while? And then after the Boston Marathon bombings, they really needed to revamp their counterterrorism division and policies and stuff. So worked with them on that mostly, and on countering violent extremism, but also on broader stuff around, like I said, community policing, community relations, issues around the police and various minority communities. So yeah, it was an interesting job. It kind of combined a few disparate things that I'd been doing in my careers in an interesting way.
Okay. And then in a surprise, because you're supposed to be back for a while, and I was very excited, and I met Peter, your husband, and we are like, oh, they're
Yeah.
going to be here for a while. This is awesome. But then he had an opportunity to go back, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we met each other when we were both working in foreign policy circles. We both met when we were working in Iraq, actually, during the war, in around 2004. And he is a Coptic Egyptian from Australia. I'm Coptic Egyptian from America. And, we kind of met professionally, and we ended up getting together. And for a long time, we had did the back and forth, spent a bit of time in the US and Australia, but he'd always been interested in politics and wanted to run for electoral office. And so he finally got the opportunity to do so. A parliamentary seat opened up, and he ran for, the pre-selection, which is the equivalent of the primary. And then he got elected. So now he's been in the Australian Parliament as an elected member for, gosh, it's been 3-4 years now. He's gone through 2 election cycles. So yeah, so that's kind of what we're doing. And I'm still working on foreign policy and national security. I work for a think tank here in Australia, work at a research university, taking a look at similar issues, and then still maintain a lot of networks and plugged into kind of government circles and academia back in the US as well in that area.
So I wore this for you to celebrate your being from Boston. So it says straight
Yeah,
out of Boston. So
thank you. We really miss it. Yeah, we miss being in Boston. Missed it especially this year because we like to come back for a couple of months during the summer, as our friends know. But obviously, because of the pandemic, we weren't able to. So
yeah.
fingers crossed next year.
Yeah, and we love seeing you when you guys come. And I again, like I was so excited. I was like, oh, they're gonna be here for a while. It's gonna be awesome. And then how can you be disappointed when he goes back to be in the parliament? It's like, okay, like
Well, I was a little, I have to admit, I'm still,
well, you like yeah. I mean, this is
not gonna
again
lie.
like Mary. If like God forbid, I got like the best possible job in the world,
Yeah.
and was like 100 miles outside of Boston, and we had to move, she'd be devastated. Like forget like on the other side of the world. Like it's not
I
even.
know.
Yeah.
It's hard, but I think both of us kind of come from a place of like public services is very important to both of us. We've both been involved in politics for a long time. These opportunities do not come around very often. And I know people are quite cynical about politics and the political process, but I still think it remains one of the most fundamental vehicles for change that exists. And no one can really do this on their own. It's like, yeah, it is the elected person that's there, but they need a support system, they need staff, they need their families, and we both have a commitment to it. So as difficult as it has been, and like as much of a negotiation between the family and the personal and the professional, and the commitment to service, which is how we take a look at it. It's kind of a once in a lifetime, once in it's an opportunity that comes few and far between, to actually try to make an impact on your community and the world.
So I don't know anything about well, that's to presume I know something about how things work in the United States, which I kind of don't. But I know even less about what happens in Australia. So, what are some similarities or some differences that you think between the political systems here and there?
Well, there's a few. I mean, your point about not knowing a lot about how politics works is actually like one of my pet issues, because I feel like civics education is really, really important. I don't know if you remember in school having to go through civics education and learning about our government and how it works and stuff, but I certainly went through it. I got a great education, and it kind of sparked my interest in politics and policy. And I feel like we haven't been doing enough of that. And people, if they didn't get it in their schooling, they actually haven't educated themselves properly in terms of how our government functions, because I think it'll take away a lot of the disillusionment or disenchantment with politics, because if you don't understand how the process works, it seems completely dysfunctional. And a lot of times it can be dysfunctional, I'm not discounting that, but the expectations of, say, what a president can do or what a congressperson can do is so out of whack with the way that our system actually is, that I think that civics education and trying to understand how the politics works on a local level, state level, national level, is actually really important. But to your question about the similarities and differences within Australia and the US, they're both established, consolidated Western democracies. The difference is that we have an executive system and three branches of government, with the president as the executive, which enforces the laws, Congress, which passes the laws, and then the judiciary, which makes judgments on the legality of laws. In Australia, it's a parliamentary system, so the executive actually arises out of the parliament. So imagine as if the election is for only Congress, and the president arises out of Congress. So Congress would pick the president. That's a shorthand way to explain the parliamentary system. Australia is also a Commonwealth country like Canada, so it maintains that connection to the British Commonwealth, as well as the Queen as the head of state, but it's largely, symbolic. It is its own country with its own foreign policy and stuff. So those would be the two major differences. In terms of how the body politic is, I'd say Australia there is polarization here. There are a lot of ideological difference. It is growing, certainly not to the same extent as America. I think it's a lot more cohesive in Australia. There's a more of a sense of collective identity. The way that the best way I think to look at it is the response to the pandemic in Australia versus America. I mean, in America, it's completely divided. There's mask wearing has been politicized. It's just completely all over the place. It's kind of disconcerting, the lack of collective action that Americans have been able to muster in order to beat back this pandemic. Where in Australia, you have the virus pretty much completely eliminated for all intents and purposes. I was here in Melbourne, and in the beginning, we had probably a few hundred cases a month. The government enacted a very, very strict lockdown to the point where I don't think it would be tolerated in the US. We weren't allowed to leave our homes except for certain reasons. Schools were shut down. There was a curfew. It was probably one of the strictest lockdowns in the Western world, if not the entire world. People got through it. It was a 6-week lockdown, and then it went back to normal. We had another outbreak because of a slip up in the quarantine program in travel. We went through another 2-month lockdown of the same. And I can't imagine people sticking to that type of lockdown in the US and complying. But in the end, here in Australia, we've gotten through it, and it's virtually eliminated. Whereas in the US, the cases and deaths are just, the numbers are unimaginable. So I think that's one of the big differences when we talk about cohesiveness and lack of polarization between the two countries. But that being said, people will refer to Australia, for example, as the 51st state because of the close relations between the two countries and the cultural similarities and the way that American culture has kind of permeated Australia as well. So there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of closeness. I see it professionally as well. Australia and the United States are probably the two closest allies. So lots of similarities, but differences as well in terms of how people view community, view their relationships with government, certainly less polarization.
And how does that translate into internal church? I don't want to say church politics, but like within our community. I mean, here you have people that are, anti-mask and anti-precautions, and I don't want to bring up a hot button issue, but like the spoon sharing, which in the Eastern Orthodox Church has, been problematic. And instead of, learning from that and saying, maybe we should take precautions, maybe because it's politicized, maybe because it's been sort of spiritualized and, made as a matter of, forgive me for saying superstition, that you can't get sick from communion. I don't know. I can't make sense of why people think that. Is that phenomenon happening in Australia also, or can you potentially connect that to the political situation?
Well, I mean, like you said, kind of church politics is a little bit different. And look, there was a bit of that. There was a lot of unhappiness with the strict lockdowns within the church community. But there's a really strong culture of compliance here. So, for example, church services and church gatherings were effectively banned. So the rule from the government and the regulatory bodies were you could only have like live stream service, where it would be the priest and probably, I think it was a maximum of like 4 other individuals doing the church service and then live streaming it out. And so there was no one going to church. It was not allowed. Churches would be fined if they were opened. It was same thing for weddings and same thing for funerals. I think funerals was a max of 10 people. Weddings were a maximum of 5 people. And so there was no communion being given because the rules were so strict coming from government. And there was a big culture of compliance. Even though the church might not have been happy about it, they did it anyway.
So in the narrative and in the conversations that people are having, do you feel like there's this political divide where there's like, liberal, conservative, there's, sort of ultra this and ultra that? Or does it seem like because the political environment is more moderate in Australia, the church environment is also more moderate?
So I'd say with the pandemic, it was less politicized overall. So within the Coptic community in Australia, like again, there was like a high degree of compliance, a degree of understanding that these were the rules that were necessary. And even though it might have been disappointing for people not to be able to go to church, for, I think it's been 8 months now that the churches have only recently opened up to a normal level. There was an understanding, and there was a broader understanding of the need to kind of do these temporary measures in order to keep the broader, community safe, as well as our own church community. And it was interesting too. There was a lot of appreciation, I think, from older members of the community who are particularly vulnerable for these shutdowns from the church. But in terms of other issues, certainly the Coptic community is highly conservative, right? And so they will tack toward more conservative social positions. Whereas the state that I live in Victoria, is actually quite progressive, and progressive in a number of ways that I think are butting up against the church in interesting ways. So a couple of examples, one of them is about mandatory reporting with, say, child abuse. And so for a long time, the confessional was kind of sacrosanct and an exception to that. So anything told in the confessional, for example, and other professions, you weren't considered to be, you weren't mandated to report that. That law has now changed. And now priests in the confessional are considered mandatory reporters. So obviously that butts up against, the sacrament of confession in the Coptic church. And so there was a lot of turmoil around that in the church community here. The other thing, there are laws being passed against conversion therapy for individuals who of a homosexual orientation. This is something the church is grappling with now here too. So there's a lot of progressive legislation that the church here has to come to terms with in their enacting of those. So it's not smooth sailing by any means. There's definitely ideological differences. The church is more conservative, and you're living within more a progressive cultural and political environment here in Australia. So yeah, these are things that the church is going to have to come to terms with. But again, that culture of compliance is really heavy here, and especially, say, with the reporting of child abuse. While it's something that the church has grappled with and figuring out how the sanctity of confession can be maintained and how our theological principles around that can be maintained, there's still a big recognition that for the overall safety of the community, it's something that has to be done.
I didn't realize that this whole 51st state thing is new to me, but I mean, it really sounds like it. It sounds like you guys have like the same issues and the same conversations and the same challenges happening over there. Is there an internal response, like, to, all of the allegations and all of the, issues that have come up in 2020 related to sex abuse and, allegations of clergy abuse? Is that something that's being responded to internally over there as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, I've been involved in an effort with the Coptic diocese here in Melbourne to put together child safety policies for the diocese. And this was something that we've started 2 years ago, right? So before all of these allegations have come out. So there was a recognition that we had to do this. And it was a recognition that we had to respond to the regulations and the new laws that were coming out of the state of Victoria, where we are, and the Australian government more broadly. They had a royal commission, which is like which is another word for like a congressional inquiry, right, into the Catholic Church and the sexual abuse scandals. And so a lot of stuff came out of that, not just about the Catholic Church. And so there's a big awareness in the community about the need to address these issues. I think, though, until the allegations came out more recently, and even this would be true for someone like me who has been working on this for an issue, I didn't realize the extent of it in the Coptic Church. And I think a lot of us probably shared that, I was under the impression for a long time, it's like, oh, there might be some, a few handful of cases here or there. We didn't have that same pervasive problem of cover up that the Catholic Church did. And it turns out that we do. And that's been really disheartening and disconcerting and been frustrating for me personally. I think for a lot of other people, there's still so much that needs to be done, I think, within our community to understand that exposing these evils, because let's call them what they are, it's evil, exposing evil is somehow damaging. You know, people look at it like you're damaging the reputation of the church. We're already under siege. Why are you putting more pressure on us? You know, this is going to impact the integrity of the church and people's beliefs. So there's a real resistance to that, I think, within the Coptic community, whether in Egypt or Australia or America or anywhere. But what we need to learn, I think, as a community is that we need to put things out into the light. We can only deal with issues if we expose them, if we talk about it honestly, if we have a reckoning about what's been done. And at the end of the day, we need to follow, I think, Jesus's primary teaching. You know, I mean, how many times has he spoken about harm to children? You know, if anyone harms the little children, they have no hope of being close to me or entering the kingdom of heaven. And I think that that fundamental teaching has been put to the side, I think, for organizational priorities, political priorities, reputational priorities that frankly do not supersede the safety of our children and our community.
So when there is pushback and when there are organizations that are trying to bring these things to light and they're being marginalized and labeled as fringe, what responsibility do you and I have to respond to that?
Well,
If
I think
any.
Well, I think we do. I think we do. You know, we're all members of this community, right? We're all trying to build ourselves up together. That's what a community is, right? I think that there has been for a long time, for various historical and political and cultural reasons, a concentration of power and activism and representation of the Coptic community from within the church hierarchy. And I think what the diaspora community can show is that there can be advocacy and organization outside of the church hierarchy, and as a way to hold the hierarchy to account and to be responsive. And I don't want to say that the hierarchy is like an enclosed kind of entity without any differentiation. That's certainly not true. You know, we've seen a lot of clergy who've come out very strongly against the cover-ups of the abuse and, very strongly in favor of child protection procedures within the community that I think is super important. So I don't want to paint a completely broad brush, but we have to learn as a community that we all have a voice, that we all have to work together, that we can work as a collective outside to push the church and the church clergy in the hierarchy in different directions. And frankly, in Egypt, there's not, the political and cultural environment that the community comes from. There's not a lot of that, right? It's very patriarchal. It's very top down. It's very obedience driven, and less of an emphasis or an appreciation really of these bottom up approaches. That some grassroots things like, say, the burning bush, for example. This is a lay person community driven grassroots effort that I think is important to have if we want to have any type of cultural or community change within the Coptic community.
I think some of the issues relate to something else that you brought up earlier, sort of just in passing, which, you mentioned convergent therapy, and there's some strong opinions. And, we were having a conversation. I don't know if you've heard of some of the efforts that we're doing here out of the Boston area, but, we were just having like a very basic conversation about consent and how there needs to be consent. And we were told by someone as in feedback, you don't talk about consent. We do not accept sex before marriage. That's the only thing that we need to say. And in trying to kind of just even tangentially broach this idea of, okay, what about when someone does this sort of thing, right? Because you can say all you want, just don't do it, and then you won't have a problem. Okay, someone does it. what is the path to reconciliation there? Bringing it up completely benign, completely from a heterosexual standpoint, and there was this defensiveness that automatically pushed back and said, oh, you want to get behind this gay agenda. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Nobody said anything about a gay agenda. We're just talking about heterosexual people, but there's such a sensitivity that I think very appropriately we're trying to distinguish between the person and the action. And we're saying, okay, there's these desires. People may or may not act on these desires. Again, whether someone is acting on them in a same-sex or a heterosex orientation. So I think a lot of these issues are getting sort of intertwined and they're butting up against each other and creating this huge culture clash. So how have you been able to navigate that challenge?
Yeah, completely. It's been the same thing, but I think we have to realize they're two totally different conversations, you know? But I mean, the reality is issues around sex in our community are so like verboten and taboo, and there's such a culture of repression and lack of discussion that it's really, really unhealthy. And it manifests in a lot of unhealthy ways. Just like you talked about, you can't even have a basic conversation about what consent means. And people have to realize that should also be consent within the marital relationship as well. I mean, that's something that's not even talked about. I think the main cultural belief is that, okay, you're married, and once you're married, it's like you give up certain right, particularly for women, yeah, that there are certain expectations that the husband is able to impose, and that's just the nature of what marriage is. But that's certainly not true, or the way that it should be, right? And so we need to navigate these conversations around consent and respect and boundaries and sexual education, even within the confines of marriage that the church is talking about. And so I think what you're pointing to is really a very unhealthy dynamic that we need to grapple with as a community.
And I don't know what the timeline is. And I think, we need to be cognizant that there's some people that are not ready to have this conversation. But I guess I must ask you something, which is how do we respect those people? Because again, these are people that we love. These are people that are maybe clergy, maybe leaders in our community, aunts, uncles, giddos, tetas. And like you said about the clergy, like even the giddos, tetas, tants, and uncles, that's not a homogenous group either, right? There's some people that are like, this is long overdue. We should have been talking about this for decades. And there's other people that are like, la la la, سيبك من الكلام الفاضي ده, right? So there's two sides, but how can we move forward while at the same time being respectful of the people that really just are not ready for this conversation?
I just think that the conversations in this issue is too important to say we're not ready to talk about it or we're not ready to deal with it. And look, the people may have a reluctance to tackle these issues out of their own, they're either uncomfortable for their own reasons. They might have political agendas that they're putting above that. They might have their own interests that they're putting above it. We have to understand too that all of these issues, I think, revolve around power and responsibility. And it's been helpful for me to understand it that way because, I deal in the kind of political and foreign policy realm, right? And that's all about power and the exercise of power. Sexual relationships are actually quite similar, yeah? And there's a certain logic to power and there's a certain logic to hierarchy. And they're often maintained by not speaking about certain things, not challenging certain things. And I think that that's to the detriment of our advancement as a community, the safety of our community, the respect and creation of love and harmony within our community. So there are just too many things that I think that are too important not to try to tackle. I think we can reach out to people with sensitivity and with understanding, but that shouldn't replace that shouldn't mean, okay, you're uncomfortable, therefore I won't challenge your discomfort. There are certain things that are worth challenging. There are certain things that are worth fighting for. There are certain things that are worth challenging power. And I think the safety of our children, the betterment of our relations, within our families, within our spousal relationships, are just too important. And I think it's important to recognize too that this isn't something that only our community is grappling with, but everybody, right? The Catholic Church, secular institutions. We saw the whole Me Too movement explode everywhere. I mean, this is something that the entire world is grappling with and talking about. And the first step is really airing it out, getting it out in the open, having difficult conversations. People don't necessarily have to agree with you, right? But just because people are uncomfortable doesn't mean you can tamp down that discussion just to appease their discomfort.
I'm reading now, and like our group here that we formed in the area, we're trying to like share resources and things. And one thing that was suggested was a letter to a suffering church by Bishop Robert Barron, and it talks about basically like the roadmap of what happened with and obviously like this is not the first thing out there, like in the popular media. There's the movie Spotlight, but like you said, like this isn't anything new. And I think looking at it broadly keeps us from having to go into a back and forth of this, like, well, this is what I think, well, this is what you think, okay, and this is, and then like we're trying to be arbiters of a Coptic experience that is in flux. Like it's something that is constantly evolving, and saying, well, this is what it means to be Coptic, and that's what it means to be Coptic. So maybe you can comment on how leaving Egypt and being in the diaspora and being in dialogue with the rest of the world has, and not necessarily 100% for the better, but at least affected the way that we see ourselves.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, anyone who comes from a particular background or who immigrated from somewhere else, or their family immigrated from somewhere else and has grown up in a different context, is always going to have to navigate that dynamic, right? And I think it gives you some interesting insights and some particular skills. I mean, I don't know if you felt this way, but I feel like I've gained a lot in my life, even though it was difficult at certain times, being able to understand two different cultures and context, navigate between the two of them, bring elements of one into the other. I think a lot of times we talk about the negative of that, but it actually is, there's a lot of positives, right? It allows you to kind of code switch, right? That's a term that's used a lot in the African American community, between like the way that, say, you would act, within your own African American culture, and then you go out into the mainstream culture. It's different. I feel like we do that code switching as well too within the Coptic community, to some certain extents. And certainly being out there in the world opens you up to certain things that we would not have gotten if we were in Egypt, just because of the political environment alone, and the different cultural environment alone. You're exposed to lots of different things. But I will say this though, a lot of times the Coptic professional and middle class out of Egypt right now has a lot to teach us in the diaspora community. Like, I think we think of ourselves as, well, we're the more progressive or enlightened, or we understand these things because we're living in America or Europe or Australia or Canada. When I've seen some of the newer families recently migrate out of Egypt, say into America or to Australia, their prowess in terms of organization and grassroots activism within the Coptic Church, I think, is amazing. And I think we have a lot to learn from it. They have a lot of skills and attitudes that I think we can learn from. And one of the frustrating things to me is that we've had this separation, I think, between the diaspora community and the Coptic community in Egypt. And it seems like, well, we have to answer the imperatives of the diaspora community. So, for example, oh, well, we have this priest here that's been accused of abuse, say, within the United States or in Australia, right? The answer, and we have to take care of that because we'll run afoul of the laws, because the laws are much more robust here to do that. The answer has all too often been, oh, let's take him back to Egypt. Yeah. So like, it's okay for that person to be a predator among our Coptic community in Egypt, but it's not okay, right? For us here. So that differentiation between the Egyptian Coptic community and the diaspora Coptic community, I'd like to see that bridged a bit for all of those different type of reasons. And it shouldn't be okay that just because there's different political or cultural context in Egypt, that we can just shovel these people back to Egypt and, it'll be swept under the rug there. So that way we don't have to deal with it. But at the same time, harming members of our community in Egypt.
So how do we do that then? How do we make that connection and form that bridge?
Well, I think a lot of the, we're obviously in an environment right now where those connections are so much easier, right? Just like through the internet, through social media, through our just organic relationships with our families and our friends back in Egypt, and all those connections that we have. There's been a newer groups of migrant communities coming out of Egypt in more recent years. I'm sure you see it as well too, like even within the churches, there's this kind of slight separation of those of us, say, who've grown up here, right? And then another group that's like recently immigrated from Egypt, and then another group who is like older migrants and stuff. So even trying to bridge those connections, even with our own churches, our own communities, I think we have a lot to learn from each other.
And connecting this back to what you said about the parallels between us and the Black community, I just had the same conversation with a neighbor of mine where I was like, listen, I really want to understand better and be more culturally conscious and more sensitive to what's happening, with the Black Lives Matter movement and all that. And I said, I can't say that I know what it's like to be a Black person, but I do know what it's like to be ostracized. And I do know what it's like to be an outsider. And I do know what it's like to be marginalized, right? Like both, from the sort of experience as, by proxy, like, with my family in Egypt and my parents growing up, and the stories that I heard, and also here, like as an immigrant and always feeling like an outsider. And they said, sometimes that's enough, right? You don't need to have like that direct parallel, like, oh, you know what it's like to be Black. No, you just know what it's like to be an outsider, and being able to empathize through that experience in some way. So I think it's interesting that we don't tend to fall as a community. Like, even though like we should see a movement like that and be like, no, we would never want someone to feel like an outsider, we seem to fall politically distant from that movement for some reason. So I don't know if you have a comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, again, it's, we don't want to paint the entire community with a broad brush, but I would say, the majority of the Coptic community, say, is more politically and culturally conservative, either doesn't understand the movement so much, or the Black community, or has distanced themselves largely from the Black community. Not everybody, but, let's say the majority, right? And I think for me, it goes back to that truism, which is that race is a construct, right? It's not a biological imperative. We decide what race is, what it means. It's meant different things in different points of history. And the relationship of Egyptians in particular, and Middle Easterners in general, to the question of race within the United States is a super interesting one. And if people are interested in it, there's like a lot that you can find out about it. Middle Easterners and North Africans are considered white for the purpose of the US Census in the United States. And that was done because of the lobbying of the Syrian immigrant community in the late 1800s in the United States, because they wanted to be considered in the white category so they wouldn't be considered, say, in the Asian or in the Black category, right? And that was obviously done for, reasonable reasons, because if you were part of those other communities, you would be discriminated against legally and socially and all of these things. So there's an interesting history behind that, right? And that shows you about how constructed it is. And it shows you the limitations of how race is understood in the United States. It's very literally black and white, yeah? But that's not how the rest of the world functions. There are all these really super interesting academic papers and research and discussions around what race are the Egyptians. We are North African, we're African, but we don't really identify for the most part with the African American community because we don't have that shared history. We're mostly an immigrant community. We're not the descendants of slaves. Our ancestors didn't work in Southern plantations. We don't have the history of the racial discrimination that the African American community comes from. But at the same time, we are an African community, yeah? And then our perception of what race we are as Egyptians also intersects with racism in Egypt. So dark-skinned Egyptians, Nubian Egyptians, for example, are considered, say, different than others and are discriminated against. Sudanese asylum seekers within Egypt face horrible discrimination. There's all sorts of cultural and colorism issues within Egypt as well that plays into this. I mean, how many times, you've heard parents and aunties and like uncles and stuff say, oh, she's so beautiful, her skin is so fair, or, all of the effort that Egyptian women put to straightening their hair and not having it be curly. All of these things around colorism, where fair and white and our connections to, the French colonials, and that's a point of pride, right? In Egyptian communities, whereas our Africanness is constantly downplayed. So there are all these really interesting intersections with how both race is viewed in Egypt and how we want to view ourselves, and how race is constructed in the United States. That makes it a super interesting dynamic of how Egyptian Americans in particular view themselves within the racial landscape, how they choose to identify with. Like, I remember growing up, I'd have Black friends and they loved it that I was from Egypt, and they would always try to claim me as one of their own. Like the African American community looks to Egypt and appropriates the symbolism, especially from the ancient Egyptian culture, as part of their own. We don't reciprocate generally, right? And at the same time, when I was growing up, I was like, oh, yeah, that's cool, because, like you and I, we grew up in the 90s, hip hop was dominant. African-American culture was like the cool predominant culture. At the same time, I never felt authentic enough to fully embrace it because, I can't appropriate that culture as my own because, I don't have your shared history of what it was like, say, for your grandparents to grow up under segregation. When people look at me walking down the street, they don't necessarily view me that way. So yeah, it's interesting.
I think my only limitation growing up was I didn't have the hair for it, and my dad would be like, but every time I got a haircut, he'd be like, how do you want it? And like, I would just describe a flat top, and he'd be like,
yeah,
like your hair doesn't do that. I'm like,
yeah.
I think we have a lot more to talk about, and I think your perspective would dovetail really well with a friend of mine named Avi, who I think would be interesting for you guys to connect. And I think the next layer of this is having more than one person on the conversation at one time. And I think continuing this conversation with Avi, and I'll post him next. I was terrified actually to make him the first person after Movember, just because he had such like strong views as, hopefully, and I shared this with you before we started recording. So hopefully you'll balance him out, and we'll bring you both back to continue this conversation.
Sounds good.
Any final words, Lydia? I really enjoyed this.
No, but the mustache is looking very 1960s Egyptian actor. I like it.
It's my gift to the world. What can I say?
Yeah. Are you going to keep it? It's not November anymore. Are you going to keep it?
Yeah, I mean, it's December 1st, and I'll be posting this. I haven't decided what day of the week I'll post. There's all sorts of like weird things like, oh, you post on Wednesday at 5 a.m. And it's like, I'm not posting Wednesday at 5 a.m. So we'll see when I post this, but odds are I'll still have the mustache and Mary will still not like it. So
Yeah.
it's going to be around for a while at least.
Well, that's the dynamic of the Mary Mina relationship anyway. So it's,
Yeah, I mean, listen, like I didn't move her to the other side of the world, so my facial
fair
hair,
enough.
right? Like come on, like if I move her to Melbourne so we can be neighbors, I'll shave the
Yeah.
mustache. But until that
Okay, fair
happens,
enough.
yeah. Say hi to Peter for me, and thanks so much
I
for
will.
joining us. Bye,
See you,
Lydia.
Mina. Bye.